Good afternoon or good morning, everyone, and welcome to our CPMC Town Hall today, titled, Am I Called to Accompany Another Touched by the Carceral or Detention System? And I am joined for this town hall by Father George Williams, who has also served and works with us here at CPMC, and both Father George and myself, with a few others, helped to provide the foundational training for prison ministry for CPMC. And so today's town hall will be, in many ways, just kind of going back over the basics of the services that we provide at CPMC and the mission of CPMC, as well as hopefully basic, we'll be able to provide some pretty practical points on how to kind of discern whether or not this is a ministry that you are called to, and how to go about getting involved in different forms of ministry to those that are touched by the carceral or the detention systems. But let us begin first with an opening prayer. Father in heaven, we thank you for the gift of your presence. We especially thank you for the gift of your Son during this Easter season, as we are all renewed and restored into your kingdom. We pray that you would bless us with your presence today, that you would continue to guide us along your pathways as you call us to be participants in your kingdom. We ask, God, that you would bless all of those that are involved in this very important ministry, to those that are incarcerated, to those that are detained. We pray also that you would bless all of our brothers and sisters impacted by the criminal justice system. We pray all of this through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Well, thank you, Dustin, and good morning, everybody. I'm Father George Williams. As Dustin mentioned, I'm a chaplain at St. Quentin State Prison and one of the early founding members of the CPMC. And before I talk about that, I just want to mention that if you have questions about our programming, feel free at any time to write them in the chat feature. And then once Father Dustin and I are finished talking, we will try to address as many of those we can. But basically, how we came about was we met in Washington, D.C. in April of 2018. And we were meeting in response to a need for some kind of a central go-to place for people doing Catholic ministry in jails and prisons in the United States. There had been some significant demographic changes in the early part of this century regarding prison ministry. And what was happening was kind of the old guard of people who were involved in full-time professional chaplaincy as were dying out or retiring. And so there weren't people taking their place. It tended earlier to be kind of male, white, clerical. There were some religious sisters doing prison ministry, but very few lay people. And we realized that the future of Catholic prison ministry in this country is going to be heavily relying upon the gifts of the laity. And so we got together to talk about how can we form some kind of a support network, a go-to place, a resource center that will help people who are interested in doing this kind of prison or jail ministry. And also, I knew from my own experience, I started in the Boston jail. I just kind of started from zero and learned from my mistakes. There really wasn't a whole lot of training available at the time. And I really wanted to prevent people from having to go through that rather awkward way of learning. So we came together and we decided to form Catholic Prison Ministry Coalition at that meeting. And so our first webinar was actually in July of 2018. And we'll say more about the webinars, but we've done probably 100 of them so far since then. But our mission, and of course, this is all on our website, our mission is to promote ministry to all people who are affected by incarceration and detention. We recruit, train, support, and empower those called to this ministry. And we strive to create a more just and merciful criminal justice system that upholds the dignity of every human person and advances restorative justice. So it's a pretty wide-ranging mission that we've created for ourselves, but I think we really have stepped into what had become a growing void and have created a really good, useful, and user-friendly resource for those of you who are either doing prison ministry or interested in beginning it. So maybe Father Dustin, if you could talk a little bit more about our purpose.
Right. Yeah. Thanks, George. Our purpose, and this was also a part of those conversations back in 2017 when we first started convening, at least, on the possibility of thinking about something like Catholic Prison Ministry Coalition. One of the things that was kind of first and forefront on the minds of so many that were present there was the importance of having a central hub for those that are involved in prison ministry, whether it be jail, prisons, detention ministries, to create a kind of centralized hub so that we can, again, as George was saying, that we could continue to kind of learn together, share best practices together, to find ways of connecting with people in other parts of the country that may be doing similar types of ministry, or may have also may simply complement the ministries that you're not doing, but you would like to find out more about. For example, at the time, I was primarily involved in prison ministry on death row and solitary confinement camps here in North Florida. But I knew very little about reentry ministry. And at that time, I was already thinking about getting more involved in reentry ministry. So it was a great asset to be able to talk to other individuals that were involved in Catholic reentry ministries throughout the country. But also another purpose of ours, kind of under that, I guess, if you think about it as the coalition part, that central hub, another important part of this is ministry formation. And my experience was, in many ways, was kind of the opposite of what Father George's initial experience was. Father George's initial experience was kind of being thrown out in the deep end and not really being kind of having much resources or someone to kind of guide him through that early process. I, on the other hand, benefited from someone who had over a decade of ministry experience, and that was Brother Dale Resinella, who was the Catholic lay chaplain on death row here in Florida. And he instructed me and gave me a lot of time to be able to kind of find my way in this ministry, which is why we do and put such a high priority on ministry formation, opportunities for those doing prison ministry, jail ministry, detention, reentry, opportunities for families to learn more about the systems that their loved ones are impacted by, and also victims, those that have been victimized, to find resources, care and support as well. So it's very comprehensive, very holistic in that regard. But we also provide at CPMC, as Father George was mentioning, educational webinars, town halls, and an extraordinary database of organizations and resources. Again, kind of practicing that central hub feature as a critical part of the purpose of CPMC. But we also, and this has kind of come about here in the past year or so, we've sought to become much more involved in terms of creating opportunities for joint action and legislation on behalf of criminal justice reform through a Catholic lens and promoting restorative justice practices. That's also kind of under the canopy of what CPMC is involved and is doing. So in many ways, through the website, but also through these webinars, town hall meetings, the convening that we had in December with a day of kind of a retreat in a way, intensive kind of virtual retreat that CPMC brought on. All of this is an opportunity to create a shared virtual space of best practices, interest group dialogue, and collaboration. And in that way, we think that we provide that kind of professional, ongoing ministerial and professional development for practitioners in this ministry. Finally, here, just to say, when we ask the question, who is included in our CPMC tent, it's a pretty big tent if you think about it, because we're talking about prison ministers, those involved in ministry in jails, detention facilities. We're also talking about reentry and those that are formerly incarcerated. And again, as I said just a moment ago, we're talking about families of incarcerated. We're talking about victims and family members of victims. We're talking about ordained and lay people, those that are employed within these jails and prisons, but also volunteer chaplains. And then we're also talking about organizations, nonprofit organizations, and dioceses. So it's a pretty broad tent. And I think you'll see that we do provide so many different types of resources and opportunities for all of those that are considered under that tent. And now I'll pass it back over to you, Father George.
Thanks, Father Dustin. I wanted to talk a little bit about getting started. And the question is, how do I know if this ministry might be for me? And I guess the short answer is you'll know. As soon as you walk in the first door of the jail or prison, you'll know that if it's for you. It's not for everyone. It's demanding, it's difficult, it's stressful at times. It's also full of grace, beauty, and life-affirming experiences. And it's not something you can just walk into unprepared for. It really is a calling. And because it's a calling, it requires discernment. And it requires us to have a solid prayer life. And as Catholics, to be grounded in our relationship with Christ and be nourished by the sacraments of the church. These are all essential things that you have to be practicing before you even step into the prison or the jail. And because you're entering into kind of a spiritual battlefield, and without the grounding in that, you'll burn out really quickly. So the basic requirement is a sense of calling to this work and having a good prayer life, hopefully a spiritual director. And part of what we're working on at CPMC is creating a network of people who can be directed to as spiritual directors. And of course, participation in the sacraments. And that's the spiritual component. There's also the cultural learning. When you walk into jails and prisons, you're walking into distinct cultures that are different from this outside world. And I think in the US, the prison and jail cultures are pretty much similar from region to region. There might be minor differences, but basically in all jails and prisons, there's a language, there's a way of doing and perceiving things that's unique to the carceral landscape. And it's unlike any parish or social ministry you may have been involved in. So you have to learn that culture. And I recommend a book by a man named Lenny Spitali, who is a friend from New England. He had been incarcerated. Now he's a pastor, evangelical pastor. And he wrote a book called Understanding Just Jail and Prison Ministry Inside and Out. And his name is Lenny Spitali, Spitale. And I think it's the best book out there in terms of getting a handle on understanding what's going on in the jail culture or the prison culture you're stepping into. The other most essential book that you need to read is Dale Resinella, who Father Dustin mentioned. He wrote his book called When We Visit Jesus in Prison, A Guide for Catholic Ministry. Both these books are available on Amazon. They're not that expensive. I think Dale's book is the best book on Catholic ministry I've ever read when it comes to prison or jail ministry. So it's kind of essential reading. These two books, Spitali and Resinella, if you read those, you'll have a good, at least intellectual understanding of what's going on. But of course, it's not just about head knowledge. You have to, it's really work of the heart. And so keeping your heart open and your prayer life active is utterly essential. You can't just know about this stuff. You have to have a feeling for it. And that's where the calling comes in. There's a really steep learning curve in this ministry. And Father Dustin will speak in a moment about the difference between jails and prisons. But you also have to be aware that this work takes time. It takes time to learn. You'll make mistakes. But the more preparation you have, the less serious the mistakes will be. But I would say essentially be prepared if you're starting out. It'll take at least a year for the staff to trust you, to begin to trust you. once you develop good rapport with the staff, your work becomes a lot easier. But it's really easy to lose the trust of the staff if you make bad decisions. And that loss of trust can really jeopardize or even end your effectiveness as a minister. So, so having the sort of background in mind, if Dustin, if you could speak a little bit to the differences between jails and prisons.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Father George. And having done both, I think the main difference is that is a lot of transitioning happening in a jail. One, they're just not they're not as stable. They're not intended to be as, say, long-term kind of stable in terms of stability, in terms of people that are there that you're ministering to. Maybe they're just for a week. They may be there just for a month. Most are there under a year. They are either awaiting their court date, or they're awaiting a trial and then being sentenced and sent off to a prison. So there's a lot more movement and, I guess, kind of fluidity when in talking about those that you're ministering at a county jail. Another, I think, whereas with prisons, right, and there's a lot of movement that happens in prisons as well, at least in my experience, but oftentimes it's not necessarily uncommon that you have men or women that you're ministering to in a prison who have already, right? So being at a prison means you've already gone to trial, more or less, most of the time, and you've been sentenced. And so now you're in the correctional system and at a prison facility, whereas oftentimes people that are in jail are awaiting their court date or their trial to then be sentenced. Some now are sentenced to jail. That's kind of, it gets a little bit complicated. So when you're administering prisons, oftentimes you have a considerable period of time to be able to minister to this person over a period of time. Another, I think, significant difference in my experience in ministering in jails as opposed to prisons, in jails, oftentimes you're ministering to your neighbors. And this is something I think it's important to think about when you go into a jail, that you're ministering to your neighbors, to your sisters and brothers that are part of your community, likely because you're from the same county or at least a neighboring county. So these are people where the degrees of separation are not that significant. And so it's not uncommon, in my experience in jail ministry, that you have mutual people that you may know. Now, if you're at maybe Cook County in Chicago or Orange County and in Los Angeles, it might be a little bit different. But here in Tallahassee, a kind of medium-sized town, usually there's maybe 2 degrees of separation between myself and the people that I'm ministering to. And there's also more opportunity than to talk about possible organizations or ministries for people to get connected with, because you know those ministries and organizations in the city, the county that you live in. So it's interesting in that regard. Now, I'll also say this, and I don't know if anyone else has had this experience, but my experience in jail is that oftentimes it's like triage. You're ministering to someone as they've first, they're still within the hours and days of the crime, of the charges, of the arrest. And they're dealing oftentimes with that shock of separation from their community, of the events that led up to their charges. And so it is like ER kind of chaplaincy. So it's more intense in that regard. They're also they haven't become acclimated to the carceral or detentional system. So there's a kind of rawness in that early stages in jail ministry, whereas in prison ministry, oftentimes we're already now that you're dealing with men or women that have more or less adapted that may not be entirely accurate, maybe more case by case, but I find that people tend to be a little bit more routinized. They've got their own kind of routines within the prison system. And now they're looking at, how to do their time and perhaps really thinking about kind of long term what it means to be in the prison system long term. So those are some immediate differences. And I don't know here, Father George, if you have anything maybe to add to that in terms of your experiences, because I think there are these differences, but obviously there's a lot of similarities as well.
No, I think you describe it exactly the way I think I've experienced it. Is jails tend to be the emergency rooms, and hospitals are more the chronic care facilities. But in both cases, even though, so they're very different in the way you are going to experience what the people are going through. They're going to be experiencing different issues, different problems. But ultimately, they're the same, and we're always doing a ministry of compassion and our ministry of presence. We're just, the most important thing we can do is listen. And because being heard is what most people who are incarcerated or detained want, and what they rarely get. So we can do a great service in both situations just by listening, remembering that we're there representing community, a community that believes in the mercy of God and the reconciliation, that people who are dealing with all kinds of shame oftentimes, and guilt and trauma. So we want to come to that in the spirit of compassionate healing. Again, being aware, as Father Dustin mentioned, especially in the jails, you're dealing with immediate loss and sort of the shock, but all through the whole system, there's all the stages of grief people go through as they continue to lose their freedom, they lose their connection to the people who are significant in their lives. So I want to say a little bit about the foundational requirements that we believe are sort of essential for any kind of carceral ministry. And we've come up with basically a 30-hour formation idea. We have prepared, and we're continuing to update what we call Prison Ministry 101. And it's something that Father Dustin and I have been working on since the beginning. And the idea was to provide, say, 15, 16 hours of formation based on our experience that helps you with the very essential, the building blocks of what this work entails, things that you need to know before you walk into the prison, or if you're already in there, things you need to be, skills you need to be sharpening and working on. There's a certain degree of clinical preparation that's required, and we always recommend that you work with a mentor. And as Father Dustin mentioned, he was fortunate he had Brother Dale Resinella. I did have some mentoring, but it was not as consistent as I think he was able to have. But it's really important that you are able to learn from other people. And partly the reason we're doing the Prison Ministry 101 is that we're trying to also provide mentoring to people out there in the world of the internet who can't necessarily come to San Quentin, for example, and work with me, or come to Tallahassee and work with Father Dustin. We believe you need to have hands-on ministerial experience. Again, you can read books about this stuff, and I do recommend that you do read the books I mentioned, but you have to be there, and you have to be kind of immersed in it. And that brings up then all of the kind of issues that you need to attend to, learning where what your own deficits are, what your strengths are, and also learning maybe that when we think about jail and prison ministry, we're talking about more than just the prisoners. We're talking about the families of prisoners. We're talking about the staff, the correction officers and their families. We're talking about victims of crime, and all the issues of restorative justice that are connected to that. And also the foundational requirements, it varies from diocese to diocese, but normally you need the endorsement of your local diocese, or the person who is in charge of this kind of ministry who works for the bishop. And so you have to do some kind of training with Virtus, which is or something similar that deals with child protection and abuse issues. And so there's sort of basic things you need to learn and be doing. And we address most of these in the Prison Ministry 101 programs, which we can also put up how you can get involved in that. But above all, in addition to doing that work, it's important that you have hands-on, on the ground work in the jail and prison, preferably with a person there who's had some experience. And do you want to say a little more, Father Dustin, about the formation requirements or anything like that?
Sure. Yeah. So in formation, in terms of the let's see, you just covered the training, and let's see, the requirements. I am honestly looking. Oh, here we go, I think. Oh, there we go. All right. Sorry. Took me a second. So foundational requirements, one, a minimum hour of hours is 30 hours of formation. And this includes academic preparation. So that's 16 hours of formation using CPMC Catholic Prison Ministry 101 with accompanying reflection booklets. So that's academic 16 hours. Then there's clinical preparation, 8 hours of reflection with an assigned mentor, supervisor to review reflection questions from the webinars and process the experiences in jail, prison, detention centers, reentry, families of prisoners, and parish-based restorative justice work as well. Again, you have questions or comments about these, please feel free to put them in the chat box. We'll have also a little bit of time here at the end of today's town hall if you have any questions about this. So we have 16 hours of academic formation or preparation, 8 hours of clinical preparation, and then ministry experience, at least 6 hours of mentoring in multiple settings aimed to help discern and understand and comfort at the level for ministry. That means, engaged in mentoring in different settings. That would fall under ministry experience. And then endorsements. And that is basically having a pastor or his delegate, such as a deacon or pastoral associate, provide an endorsement, a mentor, or a person from a ministerial correctional setting, and then verification of attendance at a Virtus training protection, the child protection training, which Father George mentioned, I believe, earlier. And so these are foundational requirements, 30 hours of formation. I realized earlier, probably when we were talking about jail and prison ministry, Father George, I should have mentioned something about accompaniment, because that's kind of the term that we're using. And I think this might be a good time to define what we mean by accompaniment. We've heard this term used, I think especially, I feel like more recently over the past couple of years, from Pope Francis and a number of others using this term. And I've heard it described best by a Catholic priest and theologian, Tomas Halleck, in Prague. And he describes accompaniment as, first of all, we accompany anyone. It's not designated only for parishioners or for Catholics or even for Christians. We accompany the person. And accompaniment happens oftentimes in this kind of murky space between church world and secular world. It oftentimes happens in non-ecclesial, non-church spaces, hospital rooms, prison cells, chapels that are set up for Catholics 1 hour and Muslims in the next hour. So it is this kind of ongoing kind of open space of ministry where we accompany the individual and take their values seriously. and where we have this great respect of persons and of the dignity of all people. And these aren't just abstract kind of terms, but for those of us that have been involved in this kind of interesting kind of space within the carceral system or in detentional systems, we often know, it's certainly been my experience, that I may visit with men who identify as Catholic or Christian for a couple of months. And then the next thing I know, they are now identifying as Jewish or as Muslim. So there's this kind of spectrum of religious experience. And oftentimes a man or a woman will get quite the tour of world religions and spiritualities. And that is never for us to judge the authenticity of those experience and the meaning of those experiences that these men and women are having. Accompaniment doesn't get involved in that regard at that kind of level of, well, you need to be Catholic or you need to make a decision, Catholic or Muslim or Jew or, whatever Protestant denomination. But rather, in the experience of accompaniment, we accompany them through these experiences, leading them to the reality of the God who loves them, of a God who is full of grace and mercy. And I think that happens most, in my experience, would be through listening and that ministry presence. And with that, Father George, I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that ministry of presence.
No, thank you for that. And also, I wanted to point out that you and Joe Cotton have done a beautiful job on the issue of spirituality accompaniment in one of the town halls. And that's, Kara put that in the chat feature for people to refer to. Another thing in terms of accompaniment, I think you covered it pretty well. It's that ministry of being with people regardless of what their background is. The trouble is in the jails and the prisons is that they're getting a heavy dose of proselytization, usually from fundamentalist groups of various stripes. And I think it's really important for us not to go in there with this idea of we have the truth and we're going to give it to them and we're going to fix them. That's where our faith in God comes, that God's the one who does the healing. We don't. But we witness to that. And we're giving people the freedom to make choices and to grow in their spiritual life without, and I think that's the worst part about the prison religion thing oftentimes, is that it can be very coercive for people. And we're not about that. We're not about proselytization or making people think a certain way. Somebody pointed out too, as we were talking about the differences between jail and prison ministry, I don't want to let this escape, is that they're run very differently. And thank you, Greg, for making this point. Jails are generally run by sheriffs, and they tend to be elected people. And prisons are usually run by, they're run by on the state level by a Department of Correction, or on the federal level by the Bureau of Prisons. And the state and the federal level, they tend to be much more professional, frankly, in terms of their awareness of how to run prisons and how to do them. And there's not as much of kind of you have sheriffs changing over each election cycle very often, or they tend to get elected and they hire their cronies who have no experience in correction whatsoever. Whereas the people who are involved in the departments of correction on the state and federal level usually are people who are very well trained and aware of what they're doing, frankly. Another thing is somebody wanted to know if, like, in our formation, do we touch on the history of the US penal system and mechanics of the legal system? Yes and no. I mean, we don't go into great detail on that because you can learn this from sources. You can learn this on your own. And there's plenty of good material out there that describes the US penal system from the very beginning, from way back in the time of the American colonies until now. But it's important to realize that, we're dealing with a system that is constantly evolving. And so we can't teach you everything in the formation process, but we can certainly guide you to the materials that you need to know. And I'm wondering, Kara, could you put up the upcoming foundational trainings slide for people? Because I want to talk a little bit about the nuts and bolts of this. If you're interested, if you're already doing this work or you're thinking about beginning to do it, and you want to participate in our foundational formation program, basically the program consists of 6 one-hour facilitated Zoom sessions that are synchronous live with myself or Father Dustin or another experienced chaplain. And then there's expected readings and preparation between the sessions. Some of that might include, say, the history of the prison system. And the fee for the program is $150 per person. And we need a minimum of 10 people to hold the program and a limit of 15 people to make it manageable. And no fee is required until you're accepted into the program. And at the end, you receive a certificate of participation upon completion of the program. And as you see here, we have several trainings scheduled starting in the end of this month. And we also have all of our materials are available in Spanish, and we run foundational training in Spanish as well. And we also have a training that's specifically geared toward people working with juvenile detainees. And so if you have questions about this, of course, you can contact Kara at CPMC for any more details, but that's the basic information. And you could, if you go to the chat feature, Courtney's put in the applications for this, a link, so you can copy that and then at your leisure contact us. So that's the immediate upcoming training. I want to say a little bit too, perhaps, and Father Dustin too, if we could both kind of talk about the webinars, the town halls, the advocacy network, spiritual direction, and peer support groups. As we both mentioned, we over the course of the last almost 7 years now, we have generated maybe about 100 webinars covering a vast area of interest in both prison and jail ministry, as well as peripheral issues around working with, say, in the criminal justice system, working with restorative justice issues, working with staff, working with victims of crime, trauma, all of the things that we think are essential for jail and prison ministries, both chaplains and volunteers, to be aware of it. Look at it as continuing education. And these are available free on the website at any time. And it's a great resource. It's something that had not existed before in the Catholic prison ministry world. The kind of information that we're offering there free of charge. And so I think it's a wonderful opportunity that I wish I'd had that 30 years ago. And also it gets into some of the areas around specialized training you need to know. And we talk about that in the town halls as well. Town halls, do you want to say, you've done more town halls than I have, Dustin. You want to say more about those?
Yeah, well, I think this is, as Father George and I were talking at the beginning about kind of the purpose, the mission of CPMC, and in many ways, I think the town hall kind of encapsulates that mission well, because it's all about collaborative sharing and learning best practices. And so we may have a town hall on reentry, or a town hall on ministering to those that have been traumatized and learning how to kind of navigate difficult emotional terrain with those in the carceral system or in the detentional systems. And so with a town hall, it's an opportunity to hear someone present, someone who his organization or ministry has gained a lot of knowledge and insight into that particular ministry, be it reentry or prison ministry to those that are detained. And after the presentation, there's an opportunity for those like us to be able to ask questions, to perhaps make even a point of comparison to what's happening in that ministry is also happening in my ministry in North Florida, or maybe happening in someone's ministry and organization in New Mexico. And so it really is that kind of hub, those town hall meetings. And it's an opportunity to hear from others and also to provide your own kind of collaborative kind of insight and suggestions. And yeah, so, and maybe Father George, you might want to say more about this new feature that we have at CPMC of connecting those involved in these ministries with spiritual directors.
Right. This is coming out of needs that people have expressed. And one of the things that I think is really important about the CPMC project is that we are responsive to the needs of people out there. So when people write to us or call us with some idea, we need to know about this, we are able to find the resources to address those issues, because we can't think of everything. And there's so many different things that we could cover. And one person asked about, does our existence as a resource center cover people who don't necessarily go into the behind the walls of the prisons or the jails? And the answer to that is yes. There's very important ministry people can do without ever having to step into a jail or prison. And often that involves working with victims of crime, working with prisoners' families, working with families of staff members. And certainly praying for people is perhaps the most important ministry we can do. So thank you for that question, Linda. And yes, we are very much aware, like pen pal ministry is a really important thing. And we do have resources that address some of that. I think it's too, in terms of our advocacy, we realize that it's not enough just to go into the prison or the jail. I think it was the Dalai Lama said, the goal, if we see somebody trapped under a rock, is not to crawl under the rock with them to see what it feels like, is to help them get them out from the rock. And so partly as we go into the jails and prisons, yes, we want to address the immediate needs of the people who are suffering, but we also want to step back and look at the system that we've created in this country, which frankly is horrible. And compared to many other Western industrial countries, we are really primitive. And the way we treat people in this country, in our prisons, jails, is scandalous. So we need to, as committed Christians, speak about this. And so one of the ways we do that is through our advocacy network. And if you go to our website, you see there are a number of different organizations that we're connected with who are they're friends, and they're people that they're also involved in this kind of work. One thing like the Jesuit Solidarity Network, for example, just comes into my mind, being a Jesuit. But there are many others. And so there's ways that you can become involved in sort of the political side of things. Now, maybe you can't do that as a chaplain because you might get in trouble, but there are plenty of opportunities and the need for people to address the system on the outside and to work toward more restorative justice practices and moving away from what had the practice that had arisen in the 1970s and 80s of mass incarceration, of pretty much locking people up and throwing away the key and being very punitive. And right now in California, we're going through this thing called the California model that was the governor initiated, and San Quentin is kind of the test case of it, where we have become a rehabilitation center. And the whole focus is moving away from this idea of punishing people to how do we actually help them so that when they leave prison, they're actually going to be able to contribute to society, not be worse off than when they came in. And next week, Warden Chance Andes and I will be presenting from San Quentin, the California model. But that's one area perhaps where you could get involved in advocacy in your own local area. Say, hey, you know what they're doing in California? Why can't we do that here? That's one example. So, and finally, I want to talk, and you mentioned spiritual direction. We will continue to collect the names and contact information for people who are willing to be spiritual directors for people, and then so that we can connect you to somebody who's available. Now, oftentimes it's not necessarily going to be one-on-one. So one way we can approach this is peer support, and we've initiated a peer support group, kind of a trial that we're a couple sessions into, and we're finding that right now it's for people who are doing full-time prison ministry, and we're finding there's such a need for that kind of connection and that support in our work, because I know all of you, whether you're a volunteer or whether you're a staff chaplain, you tend to be kind of in a lonely ministry. You tend to be isolated behind those walls. And so it's really important that we have a network of connection to other people who are experiencing what we're experiencing, who perhaps have been there and can support us prayerfully, emotionally, and spiritually as we want to continue to thrive in this work. I'm thinking, I may have left something out, in which case, Father Dustin, feel free to mention, but I also want to leave some time to answer some of the questions that we have coming up on our chats. Is there anything I want to mention, Father Dustin?
I think you got it all. Yeah. Yep. So yeah, we can open it up for some Q&A if anyone here has a question here for at least the next 10 minutes or so that we have. It pops up in the chat box.
Oh, what is somebody asked, what is CPMC's affiliation with the National Association of Catholic Chaplains? I say that we're sort of fellow travelers in the work. We encourage our members to be part of the NACC. It's not required, but the National Association of Catholic Chaplains has great resources for people, not only in prison ministry, but other kinds of ministry as well. And I think the difference would be that NACC is a broad chaplaincy, Catholic chaplaincy organization that dealing across hospitals, jails, prison schools. We're really more in the carceral field, so jails, prisons, detention centers. So the difference is really probably in focus. We very much work in line with what the NACC does, but we are focused very clearly on the carceral system and the detention system. Somebody also asked, when there's time, they'd like to bring up two things: the lack of family support and the necessity to involve individuals who have lived experience. That's a great point. And one of the things we're striving to do is getting more voices from people who don't look like me, people who have been in the system. In fact, one of our board members is a former prisoner. And it's important that we listen to the people who have been there, and because they're our best teachers. And certainly I've learned more from the prisoners than anybody else, how to be a chaplain, because they tell me what they need. So I think that's a good point. And family support, I'm not sure what you mean by that, but one of the things that we're trying to do is provide the support that you need. And because oftentimes your family doesn't understand what you're dealing with, and you don't necessarily want to talk about the things that go on in the prison at the dinner table with your kids. But you're carrying this stuff, and so you want to have, this is where the peer support network is really important. But anything else you want to say about that, Dustin, or if there's another question?
No,
yeah. Well, if I can jump in, Father George, that was me. I'm Robert Tebow from beautiful gray Wisconsin, Milwaukee. Number one, for background, I am a graduate of the system, shall we say. I've been off supervision for a little over 5 years. I went back, my own experience with 15 years of supervision, watching my wife be dragged through it. So what I wanted to do when I got off supervision is start working with families. It's a fact that if you don't support the families while people are away, when they're getting ready to come home and after they've come home, it's a disaster. The home environment can become toxic in 90 days if you don't have a good support system built up for it. In Milwaukee, there's a couple of us that have been trying to work on it through circles of support and some things, but we're just having a really hard time not getting a lot of attention to it. So that's why I bring that up. I've been working, if I went into a prison system, I think my PTSD would really kick in. So I've been working more in reentry ministry.
Okay.
And we have some really, really good resources here in Milwaukee area and Wisconsin. And I wanted to bring up, and Father George, you'll love this, we're doing some excellent work with Marquette University.
That's good to hear. Listen, Robert, let me step in here for a moment, and I'd love to kind of continue and bring you into this conversation, say for a webinar or a town hall meeting, talking about what you're doing, because you raise a really critically important point: is nobody knows what it's like to be in prison better than people who have been incarcerated. And the point about families and the needs for support is crucial, because what happens, especially in prison, over time, people begin to lose contact with their family members. They begin to lose the contact with the outside world. And so when they get out, it's really a challenge. And you're right that we need to do everything we can to prepare people for that. But the best preparation would be from people like yourself who have that experience. And I just want to make some time for some of the other questions before we finish up. And somebody wants to know, what can we do to prevent people from going to prison? Well, that's where the advocacy comes in and restorative justice principles. And because jails and prisons really are political expressions of choices we make as a culture. And that means that they can change, and that we can't necessarily prevent people from behavior, but we can prevent what happens to them after they get caught for that behavior. And I think if we want to help people who have offended this community in some way, throwing them into jail or prison for 10 years and then expecting them to be better when they come out has been proven over and over again not to really work. So I think it's incumbent upon us to become involved in the advocacy network in restorative justice. Karen Clifton mentioned that we'll be featuring programs about supportive families, and we have a webinar on Rose's Room, a support group for families that's already in our resources. So that's something you can check out. And do you want to respond to Beverly, Father Dustin? She wrote, I have acquaintances interested in being present in jail prison ministry, for listening, accompanying, and believe in God, love, etc., yet do not profess much else. Are they eligible?
Okay, yeah, no, I just pulled up this question. So I've had acquaintances interesting, but yes, and believe in God, yet do not profess much else. Are they eligible? It's interesting. So I'll be pretty candid about this. I've had a gentleman who is of another religious tradition who's joined me because of his passion to serve those, especially those in confinement, who's has a PhD in social work, and I know to be an incredibly conscientious person, and exhibits these qualities that we were talking about earlier of accompaniment, and so can work within a very broad kind of faith system, but not necessarily would I describe this person as being super devout or working very closely within their particular religious tradition. So in this case, I think of, the need is so great. This is someone who I trust, who I have a sense of has these basic kinds of values and qualities that makes a ministry of presence a real thing, but is not, again, tied deeply within one particular tradition, who in this case I have found to be an incredible minister of presence and of support, especially when we consider how massive mass incarceration is. To have people that are conscientious and involved, I think is a good thing. Now, if I was doing a catechetical program or something more like RCIA, probably not. So I think you just have to kind of gauge, Beverly, the type of ministry that you're involved in and the work that you're doing, and whether or not this person you would, one, believe that they have the capacity and the skill set and the values to be able to do it well. But I don't think, so all of that to say, I don't think it's an easy answer, yes or no. I think you would have to kind of get a better sense of the person, and then understanding the type of ministry that you're involved in. Are they looking for something more catechetical? Or in my case, with solitary confinement, ministry of presence is really the main aim. So great questions. So before we go to final announcements and comments, anything else that you have, Father George, or any other questions that we may have missed?
We probably did miss some of the questions, but again, if we don't touch on it today, feel free to contact us and we will get back to you. I think, as Father Dustin mentioned, oftentimes people are interested in helping out in prisons, but aren't necessarily motivated by a religious or spiritual desire. So, I mean, there's bottomless needs in the prison: educational opportunities, various programs. Recovery is huge. So any kind of 12-step programming is essential. So, you don't necessarily have to be a a person practicing a specific religious tradition to be of help in the prison. But if you are talking about Catholic prison ministry, yeah, you probably want somebody who's Catholic. But of course, I've also worked with Buddhists, with Jewish, with Muslim volunteers. And the bottom line is we're all there for the same purpose, which is to accompany people, to be compassionate, to represent to them the existence of a merciful God. But really, we're not there competing and fighting about religious doctrine. That happens in the prison too much among themselves. We want to be sure that we're attending to the needs. So thank you all for joining us today, and thank you, Father Dustin. It's great to see you.
Good to see you too, Father George, and everyone on today's call here, the town hall. We pray that you all may be blessed with the presence of our risen Christ as you continue to accompany all of God's children. Thank you.